An old, frail man, his trembling hands clutching a worn-out wallet, never imagined that what seemed like a routine trip to the bank would turn into a nightmare. George Thompson, a veteran loyal to his bank for over 30 years, was denied a withdrawal simply because he didn't have a smartphone app. The humiliation, the cold stares, and the indifferent refusals made him feel as though the entire world had turned its back on him. When the security guard shoved him toward the door, his documents scattering across the floor, not a single person stepped forward to help. But just when justice seemed to have failed, a towering figure appeared. Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, ready to change everything. What happens next will make you believe in the power of kindness. Stay tuned for this heartwarming story, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread meaningful messages. The morning light streamed through the old window, casting a soft glow over the small room where George Thompson carefully tucked the blanket around his wife. Helen, the woman who had stood by his side for over 40 years, lay on their worn-out bed, her breath weak, her tired eyes still filled with tenderness as she gazed at him. George sat down beside her, gently holding her frail hand. Every wrinkle on his face bore the marks of years at war, the brutal battles, the near-death experiences on the front lines. He had survived gunfire, endured long marches through dense jungles, and yet, at this moment, he had never felt more powerless than watching his wife suffer day after day. Helen needed a special medication. The doctor had warned that without it, her condition would deteriorate rapidly. $500. That was no small sum for the elderly couple who lived off their meager savings. George had thought long and hard, but there was no other choice. He had to go to the bank and withdraw the money. He stood up, pulling his worn-out coat over his shoulders. His calloused fingers fumbled through the drawer, retrieving the savings passbook that had been with him for over 3 decades. He also slipped an old photograph into his pocket, a faded black-and-white picture of him and Helen in their youth. It was his most treasured possession, a symbol of the hardships they had overcome together, the family they had built, the children they had raised. His old phone buzzed weakly. It wasn't a modern smartphone with a touch screen or countless apps, just an ancient device that could do little more than make and receive calls. George barely used it, except to call Helen whenever he was out so she wouldn't worry. What he didn't know was that because he lacked a smartphone, his trip to the bank today would become a nightmare. George took a deep breath, glancing back at his wife one last time before stepping out. Helen weakly grasped his hand, her voice frail but full of trust. "Come home soon, love. I'll wait for dinner." He nodded, masking the worry in his eyes. He had faced death before, survived the bloodiest battles, but never had he felt fear like this, not because of the bank trip, but because he wasn't sure if he'd be able to bring Helen's medicine home in time. Locking the door behind him, he slowly stepped down the porch stairs. The icy winter wind wrapped around his aging frame. The old bus came to a stop at the street corner, and as George stepped on board, he had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. The old bus turned the corner and stopped in front of the First Capital Bank building, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the crisp winter sunlight. George Thompson stepped off slowly, tugging at his worn-out coat before taking a deep breath and heading inside. This was once a familiar place, a bank he visited every month to manage his savings, a place where he was welcomed with warm nods and polite smiles from the staff. But today, from the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt that something had changed. Inside, the air was strangely stifling, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards mixed with the monotone announcements from digital screens. Most of the young employees wearing wireless earbuds were glued to their computer monitors, not bothering to look up at the elderly man standing at the entrance. Customers came and went, each lost in their own hurried world, indifferent to those around them. George walked slowly across the cold marble floor, each step feeling weightless in this impersonal space. He remembered the days when older bank employees would recognize him the moment he walked in and ask, "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you today?" But now, all he saw were unfamiliar faces, young, indifferent, more engaged with their screens than the real people standing before them. He approached the teller counter, where a young woman with neatly tied hair and thin-framed glasses was focused on her computer screen. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, her face expressionless. He waited a few moments, expecting her to acknowledge him, but there was no greeting, no eye contact. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy yet polite. "Good morning. I'd like to withdraw some money from my savings account." The woman furrowed her brows slightly, as if being pulled out of a trance, then glanced at him briefly, a quick, cold look devoid of warmth. "Do you have the bank's mobile app?" she asked in a mechanical tone, as if reciting a line she had repeated hundreds of times that day. George hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't use a smartphone, but I have my savings passbook, identification, and my veteran card. I've been banking here for over 30 years. She clicked her mouse a few times, still not looking up, her voice flat and detached. "I'm sorry, sir. According to our new policy, we can't process withdrawals unless they're verified through the app." A frown crept onto George's face as unease tightened his chest. His hand clenched slightly as he replied slowly, "But this is my money. I have all the necessary documents. Haven't I always withdrawn my savings this way?" The teller exhaled softly, an almost imperceptible sigh of inconvenience. She removed one of her earbuds but kept her eyes on the screen. The new policy was implemented after the bank merger. All accounts must be digitally verified. If you don't have the app, I'm afraid we can't assist you. Her response was rigid, devoid of flexibility, like a machine following a script, leaving no room for human understanding. George felt a pang in his heart. He tried again, his voice more urgent. "You don't understand. I need this money to buy medicine for my wife. She's very sick. I don't have a smartphone, but I have everything else I need. Isn't there another way?" For the first time, the teller looked directly at him, not with sympathy, but with mild irritation and impatience. She let out a heavier sigh this time. "I understand your situation, sir, but rules are rules. If we make an exception for one person, the whole system falls apart." A wave of heat rose in George's chest. The system? This was what they called a system? A system where a veteran who had fought for his country was now unable to access his own savings because he didn't own a smartphone? He looked around, hoping for someone, an older employee, another customer, someone who might understand. But there was only silence. A few people cast fleeting glances his way, some with quiet sympathy, but they quickly turned back to their own transactions. A middle-aged man waiting in line murmured to the person next to him, "This is disgraceful. The man has been banking here his whole life, and now they're treating him like this?" The woman beside him nodded, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to get involved. George took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. But before he could say another word, the teller delivered her final verdict. "If you don't have the app, I suggest you go home and ask someone to help you install it. There's no other way." She cast a quick glance at the nearby security guard, a subtle signal. A wave of shame washed over George. He had once stood on the battlefield, facing enemies with a rifle in hand, unflinching in the face of death. Yet here, in a place that was supposed to be his financial refuge, he was being treated as an inconvenience. There was nothing more to say. He bent down to pick up an old photograph of his wife, clutching it tightly as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The bank doors opened, and a cold gust of wind rushed in, biting at his skin. George stepped outside, his legs suddenly heavy. No one inside the bank realized they had just pushed a man to the edge of despair. The cold wind swept in through the main doors of the bank, rushing across the marble floor and the gleaming rows of teller counters. Yet no one in that building seemed to feel its chill as deeply as George Thompson. His legs felt stiff, his hands trembling as he clutched an old photograph, his and Helen's, a keepsake tied to their entire life together. Everything in the bank now seemed distant, unwelcoming, devoid of the warmth of a place he had trusted for more than 3 decades. George took a deep breath, swallowing the tightness in his throat. He was not the kind of man to give up easily, not the kind to bow before adversity. He had fought in a war, endured harsher conditions than this, lost his closest brothers in arms. But now, standing before the cold, impersonal counter, he felt utterly powerless. "Please, I've had my money here for over 30 years. His voice was hoarse with emotion as he extended the photograph, as if it could somehow prove that he was no fraud, no stranger. "Policy is policy," the teller repeated without the slightest flicker of sympathy, her eyes carrying the kind of impatience that made it clear George was nothing but a nuisance to her. His jaw clenched. His fingers gripped tighter, knuckles turning white. It felt as though he was begging just to reclaim what was rightfully his. "I just need to withdraw enough to buy my wife's medication. She's waiting at home. Do you understand? I don't want anything else. I just want my money." His voice cracked this time, almost pleading. But what he received in return was not understanding, only cold indifference. The teller barely looked at him before reciting her reply like an automaton, as if she had uttered the same response countless times before. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's nothing I can do." The finality in her voice struck like a gavel. George stood still, his heart pounding, a sharp pain radiating through his chest. He pressed a hand to it, feeling the erratic rhythm beneath his ribs, his breath growing unsteady. "She's waiting for me. If I can't get the money, if I can't buy the medicine, what will happen to Helen?" A wave of fear and anger surged through him, not for himself, not because he was being treated unfairly, but because he was being prevented from doing the only thing that mattered, protecting the woman he loved. A heavy silence settled over the counter. Some customers had begun to take notice, though none spoke. George shook his head, his eyes dark with quiet determination. "You don't understand. If I don't get this money, my wife won't have her medicine. I can't go home empty-handed." The teller sighed before reaching under her desk. A small, decisive movement. A moment later, she pressed a button. On the other side of the room, 2 security guards immediately turned toward them. One was tall and broad, his black uniform crisp and rigid, his expression unreadable. The other was shorter, his gaze colder, tinged with impatience. The teller maintained her robotic tone as she spoke again. "You're disturbing other customers. I'm afraid security will have to escort you out." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman nearby covered her mouth with a hand, her eyes widening in shock. A middle-aged man, arms crossed over his chest, watched the scene unfold with quiet outrage. "This is disgraceful," he muttered, voice low but brimming with anger. "That man's a veteran. He fought for this country, and this is how they treat him?" Others exchanged looks, whispered among themselves, but no one stepped forward. They remained still, spectators to a moment that begged for intervention. George didn't move as the two guards blocked his path. "Sir, we need you to leave." The taller guard's voice was firm but not yet hostile. "I just want to withdraw my money." George's response was steady, resolute. "We understand, but you're causing a disturbance. If you refuse to leave, we'll have to remove you by force." Before George could react, the shorter guard stepped forward and shoved him. It wasn't a hard push, but it was more than enough for an elderly man like him. George staggered, losing balance, and crumpled to the floor. A small gasp rippled through the onlookers. Papers spilled from his coat pocket, scattering across the cold marble tiles. His old photograph, his and Helen's, slid across the floor, landing just beyond his reach, its edges curling slightly beneath the bank's harsh, artificial lighting. George trembled, his frail hands reaching out to gather the fallen papers, bills, identification documents, proof of his existence, scrambling to hold on to them as though, without them, he would simply disappear. No one helped him. No one knelt beside him. The teller turned away, avoiding the condemning stares of the other customers. The shorter guard merely stood there, unmoved, unconcerned by what he had done. And the bank continued on, returning to its usual rhythm, as though nothing had ever happened. George finally grasped the photograph of Helen, clutching it tightly in his palm, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in shallow, unsteady gasps. For the first time in his life, he felt as though the world had truly abandoned him. The cold wind swept across the wide courtyard in front of the bank, rustling the faded bills scattered at George Thompson's feet, but he no longer felt the chill. He sat there on the rigid bench by the roadside, his trembling hands picking up every fragment of his identity. Documents, receipts, and the torn remains of his dignity. A faded photograph of Helen and him in their youth lay dirtied on the ground, a silent witness to the golden years that this era had long forgotten. No one stopped. No one bent down to help. The passers-by, dressed in pristine suits, phones pressed against their ears, hurried past as if the suffering of an old man held no value in this bustling city. But then, amid the rush of traffic, a sleek black SUV quietly pulled up in front of the bank. Inside the car, a 14-year-old girl with sharp, inquisitive eyes pressed her face against the glass, curiously watching the scene outside. Mahira O'Neal, the daughter of Shaquille O'Neal, frowned slightly as she noticed the old man huddled on the bench, his posture one of silent anguish. She couldn't look away. An elderly man, dressed in worn-out clothes, his hands unsteady as he clutched a dirt-streaked photo, his eyes filled with despair and loss. "Dad, look. What happened to that man?" Mahira tugged at her father's sleeve, concern thick in her voice. Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA giant with a heart just as big, immediately turned his gaze outside. He followed his daughter's pointing finger, his expression sharpening. Shaq wasn't just a basketball legend. He was a man who stood up for what was right, a man who believed that kindness wasn't just spoken, but shown through action. And now, right in front of him, something was very wrong. Without hesitation, he opened the car door and stepped out, his towering frame commanding attention as pedestrians stole glances in his direction. Mahira followed closely beside him, curiosity and compassion written across her face. Shaq walked toward George with measured steps, heavy yet steady, like a giant moving through a world too small for him. As he neared, he lowered himself carefully, ensuring his presence wouldn't startle the old man. Then, gently yet firmly, Shaq placed a hand on George's shoulder, a touch that carried both understanding and unwavering resolve. "What happened, sir?" His deep voice was calm, reassuring, but also carried an undertone that warned he wouldn't stand by if injustice had been done. Slowly, George lifted his gaze. His eyes, clouded by age and sorrow, met the face before him, an imposing man with sharp, perceptive eyes, yet filled with genuine concern. And for the first time in a long while, George felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. Mahira knelt down beside them, carefully picking up the old photograph and handing it back with quiet respect. George took it, his fingers shaking as he brushed the dirt from its surface. He inhaled deeply before speaking, his voice hoarse yet laden with indignation. He recounted everything, from his attempt to withdraw money for his wife, to the way the bank employees coldly dismissed him, how the security guard shoved him to the ground, and how everyone inside simply looked away. His voice weakened as he spoke, not from lack of strength, but because the pain of being dismissed, discarded, and devalued was suffocating him. By the time he finished, a single tear had slipped down his weathered cheek. Mahira clutched her father's hand tightly. She could feel the injustice, stark and undeniable, hanging in the air like a bitter chill. Shaq remained silent for a few seconds. He simply stood there, his fists slowly clenching. Then, a storm began to rise in his chest. Not a fleeting, reckless rage, but the fury of a man who could not stand by and watch cruelty go unchecked. The anger of someone who refused to accept that a person could be treated poorly simply because they hadn't kept up with the digital world. Shaq turned his gaze toward the First Capital Bank building, still running smoothly, still housing those who had turned their backs on a veteran who had once given everything for his country. He took a deep breath and turned back to George. "You don't have to go through this alone." His voice was deep, unwavering. With firm but respectful hands, he helped George to his feet. "We're going back inside, and I'll make sure they don't turn you away again." Mahira offered the old man a reassuring smile and gently held his hand. George was no longer alone. Together, the three of them, a forgotten veteran, a basketball legend with an unshakable heart, and a young girl with boundless compassion, strode toward the bank's doors. The glass reflected their figures, a stark contrast to the indifference within. A confrontation was coming, and the people inside had no idea that the storm was about to hit. Outside the First Capital Bank, the flow of people continued bustling past, oblivious to the fact that right there, on the gleaming glass threshold, an elderly man had just been cast aside like a stranger. But this time, he was no longer alone. The towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal, solid as a fortress, strode forward with unwavering purpose, flanked by George and Mahira, toward the very door that had so callously slammed shut in the face of the elderly veteran just moments ago. Each of Shaq's deliberate steps seemed to make the space around him freeze, while Mahira clutched George's hand tightly, her eyes gleaming with determination, and a newfound indignation at the injustice she had just witnessed. The automatic glass doors slid open, but this time They were no longer just an entrance. They had become an arena where justice would confront indifference. The moment Shaq's imposing frame stepped inside, a strange wave of silence rippled through the bank. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards came to a halt. Hurried conversations were abruptly cut short, and every pair of eyes, employees and customers alike, turned toward the trio who had just entered. No one spoke, yet the expressions on their faces told a story of shock, unease, and uncertainty, especially among the bank tellers. Some customers instinctively reached for their phones, recording the unfolding moment, sensing that this was no ordinary situation. Behind the counter, the young teller who had so coldly turned George away just minutes earlier stiffened at the sight of the towering man before her. Her eyes widened, fingers frozen over the keyboard, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her face as she recognized the man standing in front of her. Shaquille O'Neal. I didn't know who he was. Her voice trembled, the firmness in her tone from before now completely gone, replaced by unease. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice, yet the weight in his gaze made the air grow heavier. "This isn't about who he is," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, each word falling like a hammer against the cold marble floor of the bank. He turned slightly and extended his hand toward George, as if compelling everyone in the room to truly see him. A veteran, a loyal customer of over 30 years, a man who had shed sweat, blood, and tears to protect this country. Yet today, because he didn't have a smartphone, he had been thrown out onto the street like a homeless beggar. The room, already silent, grew even more suffocating. Some employees averted their eyes, a few customers began murmuring to one another, but no one could deny the truth staring them in the face. Amidst the oppressive quiet, the glass door to the manager's office behind the counter eased open, and a woman stepped out with measured, purposeful steps. The sharp click of her heels against the marble floor signaled the arrival of the highest authority in the room. Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager of First Capital Bank, had officially entered the confrontation. She was not the type to be easily rattled, but today she knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. As her gaze flickered from Shaq to George, she understood that a media storm was looming, ready to descend upon her if she did not handle this with extreme caution. Forcing herself to maintain a professional demeanor, she took a deep breath, modulating her voice to sound confident, without appearing too defensive. "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neal." She enunciated each word carefully, trying to conceal the tension beneath her composed exterior. "I'm Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager here. How can I assist you?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He studied her, his deep eyes searching, as if assessing whether she was merely another corporate cog, devoid of humanity, or someone who still understood the meaning of conscience. Then, deliberately, he stepped aside, revealing George standing behind him, clutching an old photograph in his hands as if it were the last talisman of dignity he had left. "You don't need to help me," Shaq said, his voice steady. "You need to help him." Rebecca's lips pressed together, her breath hitching slightly as she realized the gravity of the moment. She looked at George, a frail old man, his eyes neither angry nor resentful, but waiting to see whether this bank still recognized the simple truth, that human beings should be treated as human beings. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her, silently demanding an answer. Then Mahira, the smallest person in the room, yet the one with the sharpest words, spoke. "You know this was wrong. You know it." A simple statement, yet it sliced through the tense atmosphere like a razor-sharp blade. Rebecca's body tensed. Slowly, she turned back to Shaq. He was still there, tall and unshaken, his gaze no longer confrontational but challenging, daring her to do what was right. She swallowed hard, and at last she spoke, her voice slow but firm. "All right, we'll fix this." Shaq shook his head, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of an immovable truth. "Not we." He corrected her, his tone low but commanding. "You, and you will be accountable for your decision." Rebecca inhaled sharply, realizing there was no way out of this. Outside the bank, a small crowd had begun to gather. A few reporters stood near the glass windows, cameras poised, and she knew. The media storm had already arrived. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to keep her shoulders from trembling as she felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the bank pressing down on her. The once spacious room now felt suffocating. No more sporadic keyboard clicks or idle customer chatter. Now, all attention was fixed on her, waiting to see how she would handle the situation. Her fingers tightened slightly around the hem of her blazer, partly from tension, partly from the awareness of the storm of public scrutiny looming over her head. It wasn't that she didn't know right from wrong, but she also understood that the decision she made today could determine the course of her career. With a professional yet hollow smile, she looked up at Shaquille O'Neal, her voice carefully polished to avoid sounding weak or hesitant. "Policy is policy. We do this to protect our customers." A textbook perfect response. A wall of corporate rhetoric designed to shield the bank from legal trouble and complaints from customers struggling to adapt to new technology. But the moment the words left her lips, the air in the bank grew heavier. Shaq let out a small, knowing smirk, but it was far from a smile of satisfaction. He folded his arms across his chest, his sharp gaze cutting through her like a razor, studying her as if trying to see past the professional facade, questioning whether she truly believed what she had just said. "Protect your customers," he repeated, his voice deep and steady, laced with just a hint of irony. "Protect them by stripping them of their rights? Protect them by pushing a veteran out onto the street just because he doesn't have a smartphone? If that's what this system calls protection, then it's been broken from the start." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The customers who had been silently observing could no longer hold back. "He's right." A middle-aged man near the front spoke up, his voice thick with indignation. "We trust the bank to hold our money, but when we need it, we're denied because of some ridiculous rule." "I don't use a smartphone either," a woman chimed in, her eyes glancing toward George with sympathy. "Does that mean one day I'll be treated the same way?" "This is disgraceful," another voice added, this time from a younger man. "This man is a veteran, someone who dedicated his life to this country. And when he needs the smallest bit of help, this is how he's treated?" The murmurs escalated into a chorus of discontent. Some customers pulled out their phones, recording the scene, their eyes flashing with a mix of anger and disappointment. Others turned toward Rebecca, waiting to see how she would respond. Rebecca felt the pressure bearing down on her. Her eyes flickered slightly as she realized the situation was spiraling out of control. She could cling to the rules, but doing so would tarnish the bank's reputation in an instant. If this video went viral, it could become a nightmare for First Capital Bank. She bit her lip, forcing herself to remain composed under Shaq's unwavering gaze. His voice came again, this time not as a question, but as an undeniable statement. People create systems. They aren't meant to be controlled by them. When a policy starts making customers feel abandoned, then it's time for it to change. Rebecca took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the frustrated customers, the ones waiting to see if the bank would salvage its integrity. She could stand her ground on policy, but doing so would push the institution into its biggest PR disaster yet. She knew she had no other choice. "All right," she said, her voice quieter than before, but loud enough to be heard through the tension-charged silence. "I'll take responsibility. Mr. Thompson, you can withdraw your money now." A strange hush settled over the room. Then George, who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, lifted his head, his frail frame trembling slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His eyes, misted with emotion, flickered toward Rebecca before tightening around the faded photograph of Helen in his hands. Shaq watched him, then gently placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. George swallowed hard before slowly extending a hand, gripping Shaq's large palm tightly. "Thank you. Thank you," his voice rasped, carrying the weight of all the emotions he had kept bottled up until now, breaking free in those few simple words. A hesitant round of applause started from one corner of the room, then spread. Some customers smiled in relief. Others cast lingering, disapproving looks at Rebecca, as if they hadn't forgotten how George had been treated just moments before. But at least they knew that today, the right thing had been done. Rebecca lowered her gaze, knowing she had lost this battle. But she also understood. This moment might be the catalyst for a much bigger change in the very system she served. And outside, reporters were still waiting, ready to bring this story into the light. Under the dim lights of the bank, George Thompson was still trembling as he held in his hands the money he shouldn't have had to fight so hard to obtain. He clenched it tightly in his palm, feeling the warmth of the bills like a lifeline after an afternoon-long nightmare. When Shaq gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a steady but respectful gesture, George could only nod, his eyes brimming with tears yet holding on to the dignity of an old soldier. There was no time to linger. Helen was waiting. George turned and hurried out of the bank, his steps urgent yet still unsteady from the fall he had taken when the security guard had shoved him to the ground earlier. The evening chill swept across his gaunt face, but he paid no mind to the cold nor to the pitying glances from those around him. His mind was fixed on one goal, reaching the pharmacy before it was too late. Shaq and Mahira watched his small, frail figure disappear into the night, their expressions thoughtful. Mahira whispered, "Dad, do you think he'll make it in time?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He knew George was not a man who gave up easily, but he also knew the world had been far too cruel to men like him. Finally, his voice was low but unwavering as he replied, "He's a warrior, sweetheart, and warriors never give up." George rushed into the street, his aging legs pushing forward as fast as they could. He didn't dare wait for the bus, didn't dare waste even a single second, because with every moment that passed, Helen's life grew more fragile. The first taxi he waved at sped past without stopping, but he didn't lose hope. He stood by the curb, his trembling hand raised high, waiting, determined. Finally, another cab pulled over a few meters away. The driver, a middle-aged man with weary eyes but a kind face, leaned over to look through the window. Seeing the urgency in the old man before him, he spoke gently. "Get in, sir. I'll get you there as fast as I can." George nodded gratefully, his breath still labored. "Anderson's Drug Store. Please, I need to get there now." The driver didn't ask any questions. He simply pressed his foot on the gas and the car sped through the city, carrying with it the last hope of an old man fighting to save the woman he loved most. As they drove, George clutched the bag of money to his chest, his eyes staring out the window without really seeing anything. He was praying silently, praying for Helen to hold on, praying that he would reach the store before it closed, praying that he wouldn't lose the woman who had stood by his side through every storm of life. The taxi came to an abrupt stop in front of the pharmacy. George handed the driver the money, not caring about the change. He flung the door open and rushed inside, his heart pounding as his eyes landed on the closed sign being prepared for the window. A young employee in a white coat, looking exhausted from a long shift, glanced up at the breathless old man standing in the doorway. "We're about to close, sir," he began, but he stopped when he saw the look in George's eyes, both desperate and unyielding. George placed both hands on the counter, his voice hoarse, a plea, yet firm with resolve. "The doctor sent my wife's prescription this morning. I need it. I can't go home empty-handed." The young man glanced at the store manager, an older woman who had likely seen many stories like this in her lifetime. She studied George for a long moment before giving a small, understanding nod. "Get him his medicine." Just one sentence, but to George it was a miracle. He stood there, hands still clenched together, his eyes never leaving the employees as they retrieved the box of medicine, carefully packaged it, and placed it into a paper bag. When the bag was finally in his grasp, it felt as though a crushing weight had been lifted from his chest. "Thank you, he repeated, his gratitude overflowing. The taxi rolled down the narrow streets leading home, but this time George was no longer trembling. In his hands was the medicine, the hope, the life of the person he cherished most. When the car stopped in front of his house, he barely noticed the pain in his legs as he hurried inside, his heart lighter, knowing he had not failed Helen. Inside the small home, Helen sat in her chair, clutching a blanket tightly, her thin frame trembling with worry as she kept glancing toward the window. When she heard the door open, she turned, her heart nearly stopping as she saw the man she loved standing in the doorway, the bag of medicine in his hands, his eyes filled with quiet triumph and relief. George said nothing. He simply walked toward her, knelt beside her, and took her frail hands in his own. His voice was raw with emotion, but every word was filled with meaning. "It's okay now, my love. I got the medicine." Helen broke into tears, not tears of pain, but of sheer overwhelming relief and joy. She squeezed his hands, her eyes filled with love. "You have always been my hero, George." The two sat together in silence, wrapped in each other's presence, in the warmth of their simple but unbreakable love. No matter the injustices of the world outside, in this home, their love and sacrifice remained eternal. In a warm little house, where George and Helen were holding each other's hands after the most nerve-wracking moments of their lives, a different kind of storm was quietly brewing elsewhere, not on a battlefield, not in the cold offices of a bank, but on social media, where justice could find a voice, where the truth could spread at a speed no one could control. Mahira, just 14 years old, yet already aware that injustice needed to be exposed, that the world had to know what had happened to George, sat in the back seat of an SUV, phone in hand, her eyes blazing with the determination of a young soul trying to change something far greater than herself. She adjusted the video she had recorded inside the bank. every second filled with the ruthlessness of the system, every indifferent glance from the employees, every cold-hearted word spoken without a shred of remorse. The moment George was pushed to the ground, papers scattered across the cold marble floor. The moment Shaq stepped in, not to intimidate, but to demand justice for a man who should never have had to endure such treatment. Everything was crystal clear. Mahira didn't need to edit much. The raw footage itself was already a damning indictment of a system that had lost its humanity. She typed a caption, her fingers swift yet thoughtful. Rules should never be placed above compassion. No need for excessive words, a short sentence, but powerful enough to shake an entire community. Then she hit post, and within minutes, the video began to explode like wildfire, igniting a parched forest of frustration and outrage. At first, it appeared on the feeds of Mahira's followers, her friends, family, a few Shaq fans. But within an hour, it was spreading faster than a breaking news headline on national TV. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments. Hashtags erupted. Here, justice for George. Here, people over policy. Here, banking with humanity. Young people like Mahira shared the video in fury, outraged by an outdated system that cast aside those who couldn't keep up with technology. Older generations shared it with heartbreak, fearing for their own future. Would they, too, be treated like George one day? Veterans shared it with rage, unable to comprehend how a fellow serviceman, a man who had once sacrificed for his country, could be discarded by the very society he had protected. This is shameful. He served this country, and this is how we repay him? Boycott this bank. No one deserves to be treated like this, let alone a veteran. Shaq isn't just a legend on the court. He's a great human being. We need more people like him. Celebrities, activists, and influential figures quickly joined the conversation, sharing the video with even stronger messages. Remember, when you allow a system to strip one person of their dignity, it's only a matter of time before it strips all of us. This bank must be held accountable. Don't let this become normal. George is not an isolated case. It's time to change the system. Public outrage erupted. Protesters gathered outside the bank's branches. News outlets picked up the story. And inside the executive offices of First Capital Bank, high-ranking officials scrambled in panic as their stock prices plummeted. And somewhere, in a quiet little house where an elderly couple held hands in silence, George remained unaware that his story had touched millions of hearts across the world. In a modern skyscraper with glass walls reflecting the cold, unfeeling light of the city, First Capital Bank was experiencing one of the most stressful days in its history. On the top floor, where the senior leadership usually made critical strategic decisions, an emergency meeting had been called. The vast conference room, with its polished walnut table, was typically a place of powerful discussions and lucrative deals. But today, the atmosphere was so heavy that no one dared to breathe too loudly. On the large screen at the head of the table, a video of George Thompson being escorted out of the bank kept playing on loop. The scattered papers on the marble floor, the despair in his eyes, and the moment Shaquille O'Neal appeared, turning the bank's silence into a social media storm. The board members, people accustomed to profit charts and financial reports calculated down to the last decimal, now sat in stunned silence, faced with the one number they could not control. Over 50 million views, millions of outraged comments, and a plummeting stock price within just 24 hours. "This is destroying our reputation," the communications director spoke up, his voice laced with anxiety. We are at the center of a firestorm. Customers are losing trust, and if we don't act immediately, the consequences will be unimaginable." Across the table, the operations director frantically flipped through a stack of documents, searching for a solution. "Can we release a statement clarifying that this was just a misunderstanding? Or, at least—" Before he could finish, Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager where the incident occurred, slowly set her pen down on the table. Her gaze was sharp, yet exhausted. She hadn't slept the entire night, not just because of the public backlash, but because something inside her had shifted. There was no misunderstanding. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to cast a heavy silence over the room. All eyes turned to Rebecca. She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say could change the course of her career. But for the first time in years of working under rigid policies, she no longer wanted to choose the safe path. "We forgot who our customers are." No one immediately refuted her words. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances, but they couldn't deny the truth in what she was saying. Rebecca continued, speaking not in corporate jargon or strategic calculations, but with the raw honesty she had buried for too long. "We built this system around technology, around risk management algorithms, but we forgot the most important thing. We serve people. George Thompson is not an isolated case. He represents millions of elderly customers across the country who are being left behind simply because they can't keep up with the rapid pace of technological change." A few directors frowned, but others subtly nodded, realizing that they could no longer ignore this reality. Rebecca turned to the CEO, a powerful man with over 3 decades of banking experience. "If we don't change now, we will lose the most valuable thing, our customers' trust." The CEO sat in silence for a few moments, his sharp eyes weighing the consequences of this decision. Then, slowly, he nodded. "We need to change." A murmur spread across the room, but this time it was not panic. It was acceptance. Within a week of the meeting, First Capital Bank made a public announcement across all media platforms. "We apologize." That was the opening line of their statement. No corporate spin, no defensive explanations, just a direct and responsible admission. They unveiled a series of major policy changes, the establishment of a senior customer support division where those unfamiliar with. Technology could conduct transactions without needing a smartphone or digital verification. A complete retraining of all bank staff, emphasizing flexibility and empathy, ensuring that no one like George Thompson would ever be treated as an outsider in the very institution they trusted. The launch of the People First initiative, encouraging other banks nationwide to implement similar changes to protect vulnerable customers. The bank's post quickly amassed millions of interactions, but this time, instead of outrage, people began to feel hope. At least they're listening. This is how a major institution should act when it makes a mistake. I hope other banks follow their lead. And more importantly, people like George Thompson, those pushed to the margins of modern society, could now walk into a bank without feeling abandoned. Rebecca Stevens, who had once stood by the system, now stood by the people. Sitting in her office, she quietly watched as news of the bank's decision spread across screens. She knew that real change wouldn't come easily, but she also knew that there are moments in life when you have to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. And today, she had done the right thing. After First Capital Bank announced its policy change, public outcry began to subside. However, the impact of George Thompson's story continued to spread powerfully throughout the community. It was no longer just about one bank making a change. It had become a symbol of compassion, a reminder that people must come before cold, impersonal rules. Elderly customers who had once felt abandoned by the system now saw a clearer path forward. But for Shaquille O'Neal, this was far from over. To him, justice wasn't just about correcting a mistake. It had to be about true restitution, something that would create lasting value, something that would make George and Helen feel that the world was still fair to them. And so, on a cool evening, as the golden hues of the sunset bathed the quiet street where George and Helen lived, a sleek black SUV slowly pulled up in front of their home. The doorbell rang gently. George, sitting by the window reading his newspaper, looked up in surprise. He wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. Helen, who was preparing dinner, paused when she saw the curious expression on her husband's face. When George opened the door, the first thing he saw was the bright smile of Mahira, the young woman with sparkling eyes who had captured and shared his story with the world. And right beside her, the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal stood, a man who had not only defended him in his most difficult moment, but had also forced an entire system to change because of him. For a moment, George froze, feeling as if he were dreaming. "Oh my, I didn't think I'd see you again so soon." His voice was hoarse with emotion, his eyes misty as he looked up at the larger-than-life figure before him. Shaq smiled, a warm, genuine smile, before lifting a large brown paper bag filled with fresh groceries, carefully selected for the elderly couple. "I couldn't show up empty-handed, now could I?" he said in his deep, familiar voice. Helen stepped forward, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much. Not everyone would do what you did," she said, her voice catching in her throat. She knew that without Shaq, George might still be just another forgotten man in society's eyes. Shaq shook his head, his expression growing more serious. "Actually, I'm not just here for a visit. I have something very important to tell you." From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a large blue envelope and handed it to George, his gaze filled with deep respect. "I've thought a lot about what you've been through, and I realized you're not just a customer who was treated unfairly. You're a man who dedicated his life to serving this country, a man who has lived with integrity and done the right thing even when life wasn't easy. So I wanted to do something that would ensure your name, and Helen's, wasn't just a story on social media, but a true source of inspiration." George looked at Shaq, then slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a formal document stamped with a red seal. As he read the printed words, his hands began to tremble. He blinked, feeling as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Shaq continued, his deep voice carrying a weight of emotion. "I've established this scholarship fund to help young students from underprivileged backgrounds, especially the children of veterans and low-income families who struggle to access a quality education. I believe that you and Helen have spent your lives giving to others, and now it's time the world gives something back to honor you." George clutched the letter in his hands, a single tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "Shaq." His voice broke, his hands shaking, not because he was weak, but because he was overwhelmed, surprised, and deeply moved. Helen stood beside him, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know what to say. I never thought an old man like me could leave behind something so meaningful for future generations." Shaq stepped forward, placing a firm yet gentle hand on George's shoulder, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You've done more than you realize, George. You've shown that even when the world turns its back on you, kindness still exists. And because of you, hundreds, maybe even thousands of students will have the chance to pursue their education and build a better future." George stared at Shaq, then suddenly he broke down, not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in years, he felt truly valued. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he still mattered in this world. Shaq extended his hand, and without hesitation, George clasped it tightly, his grip filled with gratitude and deep respect. "Thank you." His voice was rough with emotion, but every word was spoken with absolute sincerity. "Thank you for helping an old man like me believe again." Shaq smiled, not just a smile of satisfaction, but one of faith in the goodness that still existed in the world. And as the evening sun cast its last golden rays over the small house, a place where two elderly souls had once thought they'd been forgotten, they knew that their story would live on, not just in the memories of those who had witnessed it, but in the futures of the children they had never even met. After George Thompson's story spread across America and the scholarship fund named after him and his wife was established, people no longer saw him as just an old veteran forgotten by society. Instead, he became a symbol of resilience, kindness, and justice reclaimed through the simplest, yet most powerful means. But even though his name had traveled far and wide, George never thought that his story would impact the very neighborhood he had lived in for decades. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, George, as usual, opened the window, letting the early sunlight spill across the old wooden table in his living room. He had spent most of his life here, yet he never imagined that one day every step he took outside his door would be met with the warm gazes of an entire community. Helen, his wife, the woman who had stood by him through every hardship, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, as if she could sense the change quietly filling their small home. "You're in for a big surprise today," she said, a tender smile lighting up her face. George frowned, about to ask her what she meant when a soft knock sounded at the door. As he opened it, the sight before him made him freeze. In front of his house stood dozens, then hundreds of people. His neighbors, familiar faces he had known for years, former customers from the bank where he used to do business, and even strangers who had read about him online. Young students held up small signs with heartfelt messages. Veterans stood in crisp uniforms, standing tall in solemn respect for their fellow soldier. And among them, at the very center of it all, stood Shaquille O'Neal and Mahira, smiling radiantly. For a moment, George felt as if his heart had stopped beating. He had once fought on battlefields, had seen his comrades fall before his eyes, had endured the cold indifference of a modern world that seemed to turn its back on people like him. But never, not once in his entire life, had he imagined being embraced with such love. A middle-aged man, the former manager of the grocery store George used to frequent, stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "George, you weren't just a hero on the battlefield. You taught us that sometimes simply standing up for what's right is enough to make the whole world listen." A group of young students, the very ones inspired by the George and Helen Thompson Scholarship Fund, shouted in unison, "Thank you, Mr. George." Applause erupted, not the polite, obligatory kind, but the kind that carried genuine admiration and deep respect. Shaq stepped forward, placing a large cloth over something standing in George's front yard. He rested a hand on George's shoulder, his deep voice carrying both warmth and unwavering strength. "I think people need something to remember what you've done, not just today, but for your entire life." With a gentle pull, he removed the cloth, revealing a gleaming bronze plaque. "Thank you, George Thompson, a veteran with a great heart." George stood frozen, his aging eyes welling up with emotion. The plaque was more than just a token of appreciation. It was proof that his life had meant something, that no matter how much society had tried to forget him, there would always be people who remembered the good he had done. Helen stepped closer, gripping his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You deserve this, George. You've always been a hero to me, and now the world knows it too." Standing before his own tribute, surrounded by hundreds of people looking at him with admiration, George, after so many years, no longer felt small or out of place in this era. When Shaq extended his hand, George took it without hesitation. It was more than just a handshake of gratitude. It was a handshake of solidarity between a man who had once been forgotten and a man who had helped him reclaim his worth. The bronze plaque gleamed under the morning sun, a quiet reminder that there would always be a place for kindness in this world, as long as there were people willing to stand up for it. And, just as the applause rose again, a young boy ran up to George, holding out a small letter written in the unsteady handwriting of a child. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. I want to grow up to be like you." George looked down at the letter, his calloused hands trembling as he took it. Then he lifted his gaze, first to Helen, then to Shaq, and finally to all the people standing before him. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he gently squeezed the boy's hand and gave a small nod. Because sometimes gratitude doesn't need words. It only needs to be felt, from one heart to another. The sun slowly set behind the small houses of the peaceful neighborhood, leaving streaks of crimson and amber stretching across the sky, reflecting through the old window panes of George and Helen's home. Inside, the warmth was more profound than ever, not because of the roaring fireplace, but because of the quiet, heartfelt emotions filling the hearts of two people who had journeyed through nearly an entire lifetime together. George and Helen sat side by side on their familiar wooden chairs by the window, the same spot where they had witnessed countless bitter winters, torrential rains, and golden sunrises. But today, this moment felt different. It carried a sense of serenity, a renewed faith in kindness, and the comforting realization that they were no longer forgotten. On the wooden table before them, the plaque reading, "Thank you, George Thompson, a veteran with a great heart," still glowed under the soft golden light. A letter, written in the unsteady handwriting of a child, and the official notice about a scholarship fund named in his honor lay beside it. Tangible proof of a story that had not only changed his life, but had also touched the entire community. Helen gently squeezed her husband's hand, her palm still small, still soft, just like it had been in their younger days when they faced life's struggles side by side. She looked at George, her eyes filled with love and admiration. "You've done something extraordinary, George," she whispered, her voice delicate, yet carrying the weight of deep respect and affection. George smiled, a smile free of the bitterness and burdens of the past. He lifted his gaze to the fading hues of the sunset, letting the memories wash over him. The days of his youth on the battlefield, the years of hardship trying to make a living, the moments of feeling abandoned by the very world he had once served, and today, the moment when everything changed because of one small act. He turned to his wife, his smile kind but more profound than ever. Sometimes even the smallest act can change the world. Helen nodded, her voice trembling slightly as she replied, "Not everyone has the courage to stand up like you did, but thankfully, you weren't alone." George looked outside at the street in front of their home, where, just that morning, he had thought of himself as nothing more than an old man forgotten by an unforgiving modern world. But now, everything was different. Outside, a small group of students passed by, pausing in front of the plaque near his house, reading each word with admiration. One of them turned, spotting George through the window, and waved with a bright, sincere smile. George waved back, his heart suddenly feeling lighter than it had in years. Perhaps his life was not the kind of heroic tale written in history books, but it was a meaningful one. A story that reminded the world that kindness is never in vain, that even the smallest, most overlooked individuals could create change, and that a single act of goodness could ripple into something extraordinary. Helen rested her head on his shoulder, and together they gazed out into the distance, where the sunset had faded, making way for the first twinkling stars in the night sky. Somewhere out there, the light of kindness continued to spread. The story of George Thompson was never just about a veteran being denied a bank withdrawal. It was a powerful reminder of the value of kindness, perseverance, and the strength of one small act to change an entire system. From a single moment of injustice, from one man daring to stand up for what was right, we saw an entire community rise together, a corporation forced to change, and an inspirational story that reached millions. George had thought he was just an old man forgotten by the world, but in the end, he became a symbol of hope, of justice, and of kindness that spreads. And what about you? Do you believe that a small act of yours today could create a significant change in someone's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like to help spread its message, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.